Okay, let's unpack this. We've got uh, quite a stack of sources here.
Yeah, articles, research papers.
Your notes, too. And they all seem to point towards this surprising connection inside our own bodies. It's like a hidden conversation almost.
It really is a network connecting your gut and your brain in ways, we're only just starting to really understand.
Like discovering a whole new world inside you.
Exactly, with all these communication lines we barely knew about until, well, quite recently.
And that's what today's deep dive is all about. We're exploring this gut-brain axis, or I guess more accurately now, the microbiome gut-brain axis.
That's the term, yeah, because the microbes are key players.
Right. The core idea being that these trillions of tiny microbes living inside you aren't just, digesting lunch.
Hmm.
They might actually be talking to your brain, influencing mood, digestion,
Hmm.
maybe even bigger neurological stuff.
That's the picture emerging, absolutely. From mood to, yeah, potentially broader neurological health.
So our mission here is to kind of pull out the key takeaways from all this material, give you a shortcut to understanding what's going on in this really complex field.
Yeah, navigate the main highways, the communication routes, and look at some fascinating examples, especially when things go a bit awry.
Okay, let's start right at the beginning then. What exactly is this gut-brain axis?
So at its heart, it's a communication system. And crucially, it's bidirectional, two-way.
Meaning signals go both up and down?
Exactly. From the gut up to the brain, and from the brain back down to the gut. Constantly. And it's not just one single wire, it's multiple routes involved.
Okay, and the sources mention some specific pathways. What are the main ones we should know about?
Well, probably the most famous one is the vagus nerve.
Ah, yes, heard of that one.
It's this huge nerve, like a superhighway, running all the way from the brainstem down into the gut, the GI tract.
Okay.
And one really striking thing the sources highlight is that something like 80% of the signals traveling on the vagus nerve are going from the gut to the brain.
80% upwards. Wow. So the gut is doing most of the talking, in a way.
It certainly has a lot to report back, yeah.
Yeah.
And speaking of the gut having its own mind, almost,
Ooh.
there's the enteric nervous system, the ENS.
The second brain.
Right, the nickname, yeah.
Uh,
Because it's this massive network of neurons, like, embedded right there in the gut wall.
how massive are we talking?
Around 500 million neurons, which is, get this, more than your entire spinal cord.
No way. Seriously.
Seriously, and it can manage a lot of gut functions pretty much on its own. It even produces neurotransmitters, the same chemicals the brain uses.
So it's semi-autonomous down there.
Yeah.
Okay, what else? The stress response must be involved somehow.
Oh, definitely. The HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
Right.
That's your body's main stress response system. It connects the emotional parts of the brain to hormone release, like cortisol,
And those hormones affect the gut.
directly. They influence gut function, but they also change the environment for the microbes living there, affecting who thrives and who doesn't.
And the immune system. I know a huge chunk of that is in the gut.
A massive chunk. Maybe 70–80% of your immune cells are associated with the gut.
Wow.
So immune cells and their signaling molecules, things called cytokines, they form another really vital communication link back and forth between the gut and the brain.
Okay, so nerves, hormones, immune cells. But the conversation isn't just between our own cells, is it? The microbes are in on it too.
That's the game changer. That's why we now call it the microbiome gut-brain axis. These trillions of bacteria, fungi, viruses, they aren't just sitting there.
They're active participants.
Very active. They produce chemicals, or they influence our bodies to produce chemicals that act as messengers.
Like what kind of chemicals?
Things like neurotransmitters or their precursors, GABA, serotonin precursors, also metabolites like short-chain fatty acids, SCFAs, from fiber fermentation, and even things like bile acids get modified by them. These chemicals can get into circulation and affect both the gut locally and the brain.
It's just staggering to think about the scale. Trillions of them. Outnumbering our own cells in the gut, right?
By a long shot, yeah. It's like this whole inner ecosystem that's deeply intertwined with its host, us.
And the sources really hammer home the importance of early life for setting this all up.
Absolutely critical.
Yeah.
There's this window early on where the baby's gut gets colonized by microbes.
Right.
Things like birth mode C-section versus vaginal birth and feeding, like breast milk versus formula, they massively influence which microbes set up shop first.
And that initial setup matters long term.
Hugely. It seems crucial for the normal development of this entire axis, for calibrating things like the stress response, potentially for decades to come.
Okay, so they're there. They're talking. But how exactly do these tiny microbes manage to have such a big influence? What are the mechanisms?
Well, the research points to a few really interesting ways. For one, they can actually influence the expression of our genes.
Our human genes.
Yeah, including
okay.
genes involved in immunity and inflammation,
Right.
which ties back to that immune pathway we just talked about.
Right, okay.
And then there's their chemical production line. We mentioned the neurotransmitters and metabolites like SCFAs, butyrate, propionate, acetate.
The ones from fiber.
Exactly. When bacteria ferment fiber, they make these SCFAs, and these little molecules can actually get absorbed, travel through the bloodstream, cross the blood-brain barrier,
And directly affect brain cells.
directly affect brain cells and brain function. Yeah.
And wasn't there something surprising about the brain's own immune cells? Microglia.
Yes, that was a big finding highlighted in the sources. It turns out that the normal development and sort of readiness of microglia, the brain's resident immune cleanup crew,
Uh-huh.
depends on having a healthy gut microbiota. They don't mature properly without those microbial signals early on.
That's wild. So our gut bugs are needed for our brain's immune system to work right.
Seems like it. And even more, those CFAs we mentioned, they can actually help restore microglial function if it's been impaired. It's a direct link from bacterial activity in the gut to immune health in the brain.
Incredible. Do they also, listen in on our signals?
Some seem to, yes. The sources mentioned bacteria like E. coli having receptors on their surface. Receptors for our neurotransmitters, like norepinephrine, a stress chemical.
So our nervous system can signal to the bacteria.
Potentially, yeah. Changing their behavior, maybe their growth. It's truly a two-way street, even at that level.
And what about that epigenetics point? That sounded really deep.
Right, epigenetics. It's basically changes in how genes are used without changing the actual DNA code itself. Think of it like sticky notes on the DNA saying, read this part or ignore this part.
Okay.
And these notes can be influenced by our environment, our experiences, and fascinatingly, sometimes they can even be passed down.
Passed down generations.
Potentially, yes. The sources touch on how the microbiome might influence these epigenetic marks, which suggests a way that maybe experiences, even ancestral ones, could affect how our gut-brain axis functions today, like a biological memory influenced by our inner microbes.
Okay, mind slightly blown. So we have this incredibly complex nerves, hormones, immunity, microbes, epigenetics, all talking. What happens when it gets disrupted? The sources really focus on IBS as a key example.
Yes, irritable bowel syndrome. It's probably the condition most clearly linked to problems in this gut-brain communication, and it's super common.
Affects a lot of people, right?
Roughly 1 in 10 globally, maybe more, characterized by that recurring gut pain, bloating, and changes in bowel habits, diarrhea, constipation, or sometimes both.
But it's not just gut symptoms, is it? The sources mention other things too.
Absolutely not. Many people with IBS also deal with significant fatigue, anxiety, depression. These non-gut symptoms are really common.
And it has a big impact on life. Costs, productivity.
Huge impact. Quality of life takes a hit, there are significant healthcare costs, people miss work, and it's notably more common in women, almost twice as common. Plus, the intensity of the gut symptoms often tracks with how anxious or stressed someone feels.
Underscoring that brain connection again.
Exactly.
So how does this GBA dysfunction actually look in someone with IBS? What's going wrong?
Well, a couple of key things. One is altered gut motility, how fast or slow things move through.
Okay.
But maybe even more central is visceral hypersensitivity.
Meaning the gut is just overly sensitive.
Precisely. The nerves in the gut wall fire off pain signals much more readily than they should. Normal things, like gas moving through, or the gut stretching slightly after a meal, which a healthy person wouldn't even register.
Feel painful for someone with IBS.
Exactly. The gut is sending exaggerated danger signals up to the brain.
And the microbes. The dysbiosis, where does that fit in?
It seems to be right in the thick of it. Dysbiosis and imbalance, or maybe reduced diversity in the gut bacteria, is strongly linked to IBS in the sources.
What kind of imbalance?
Findings can vary a bit between studies, but common themes are things like instability in the microbial community over time, often lower overall diversity, and shifts in specific groups, maybe more streptococcus, less of the beneficial lactobacillus or bifidobacterium.
And that connects to inflammation. I think the sources mentioned low-grade inflammation.
Yeah, that seems key too. It often ties into increased gut permeability, what people sometimes call leaky gut.
So the gut lining isn't as strong a barrier.
Right. It lets things through that shouldn't normally cross bits of bacteria, microbial products. These can then interact with immune cells and those hypersensitive nerve endings right there in the gut wall.
Triggering inflammation and pain.
Contributing to the pain, the altered motility, the whole picture.
And post-infectious IBS seems like a really clear example of that chain reaction.
It really is. Someone gets a bad stomach bug bacterial, viral recovers from the initial infection.
But the IBS symptoms stick around.
Exactly. The infection seems to trigger lasting changes. Damage to the gut lining, persistent low-grade inflammation, shifts in the microbiota, increased permeability, leading to chronic GBA dysfunction.
And stress. We all know stress messes with our stomachs. How does that plug into the GBA and IBS?
Directly. Psychological stress fires up that HPA axis we talked about.
Releasing cortisol and other stress hormones.
Yep. And those hormones directly impact the gut. They can change motility, increase that visceral sensitivity we mentioned, making the gut feel things more intensely.
And they affect the microbes too.
Yes. Stress can alter the composition of the gut microbiota, sometimes favoring less beneficial bacteria. And the sources also mention that stress, especially early life stress or trauma, can potentially program the GBA to be more reactive long-term, increasing vulnerability to IBS.
Wow. Okay, so it's complex. What about diet? That's huge for IBS sufferers. The sources talk a lot about FODMAPs.
Right. FODMEs, fermentable oligo-DMA monosaccharides, and polyols. It's a mouthful.
Basically, certain types of carbs.
Yeah, specific short-chain carbs and sugar alcohols that are not well absorbed in our small intestine. So they travel down to the large intestine.
Where the bacteria have a feast.
Exactly. The gut bacteria ferment them rapidly, producing a lot of gas.
And in someone with that visceral hypersensitivity.
That extra gas causes stretching, which triggers pain, bloating, changes in bowel function.
So the low FODMA diet tries to cut down on those fermentable carbs.
That's the principle. By temporarily restricting foods high in FODMAPs, you reduce the fuel for that rapid fermentation, reduce the gas, and hopefully reduce the symptoms.
Does it work?
The sources indicate it provides significant symptom relief for many people with IBS, particularly for bloating and pain. But it's quite restrictive.
Hard to follow.
Definitely best done with guidance from a dietitian. And there are potential downsides, like it might reduce some beneficial bacteria long-term if you stay on it too strictly without careful reintroduction. And its effectiveness might even depend on what an individual's specific microbiome looks like to begin with.
Interesting. And bile acids were mentioned too, briefly.
Yes, particularly for IBS with diarrhea. Sometimes the way bile acids are handled, produced by the liver, used for digestion, then reabsorbed or modified by gut bacteria gets disrupted, and that can contribute to diarrhea.
Okay, so IBS is a clear case of GBA disruption. But the implications go wider, don't they? The sources link this access to brain function more broadly and even other conditions.
This is where it gets incredibly interesting, yeah. The research is increasingly pointing towards the gut microbiota, influencing not just mood in the context of IBS, but also potentially playing a role in major psychiatric conditions like clinical depression and anxiety disorders.
How so? Are the microbiomes different?
Studies consistently find differences, yeah. Differences in the types and balance of gut bacteria between people with depression or anxiety and healthy control groups. The how is still being worked out, maybe through inflammation, maybe through those neuroactive chemicals the microbes produce.
And it doesn't stop at psychiatric conditions, neurological ones too.
That's another really active area of research. Changes in the gut microbiome are being linked, or at least associated with conditions like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and autism spectrum disorder.
Autism spectrum disorder, ASD. The sources mentioned a high overlap with gut problems there.
That's right. A lot of children with ASD also have significant GI issues like constipation or diarrhea. And again, studies are finding differences in their gut microbiota compared to neurotypical children.
Any ideas why?
Well, one hypothesis mentioned is that the gut microbiota might influence levels of key neurotransmitters in the brain, like GABA and glutamate, which are known to be involved in brain signaling and sometimes found to be altered in ASD.
And Alzheimer's. That seems like a big leap from the gut.
It does at first glance, but again, studies show gut microbiota differences in Alzheimer's patients and also in animal models of the disease.
Any more direct evidence?
Well, one fascinating finding mentioned was detecting a specific protein actually made by gut bacteria in the cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid around the brain of Alzheimer's patients. And levels of this protein correlated with biomarkers of the disease.
Wow. That suggests a pretty direct link.
It certainly points towards pathways by which gut microbial activity could potentially influence processes happening right inside the brain in Alzheimer's.
This whole idea that our microbes can influence our brain, our behavior, has such broad implications. The sources even touched on how this science might intersect with the legal system.
Yeah, that was a really thought-provoking angle referencing Dr. David Eagleman's work.
Right.
The sources brought up how neuroscience is pushing us to think about behavior differently, discussing things like mental illness and addiction, especially in the prison population, and how our current systems maybe aren't equipped to handle the underlying biology effectively.
The point wasn't about letting people off the hook, though, was it?
No, not at all. It was more about, okay, given what we're learning about the brain and behavior, how can society best ensure safety and maybe rehabilitation? The example used was Ken Parks.
The sleepwalking case.
Exactly. Acquitted because the act happened without conscious control, but
Yeah.
crucially, the court then mandated treatment to prevent it happening again.
So the focus shifted to future prevention, based on understanding the brain state.
Right. It raises this big question, framed in the sources. How does a mature justice system start to incorporate this deeper understanding of the brain, of behavior, of these complex influences, like maybe even the gut-brain axis down the line,
Yeah.
into how it operates, not just focusing on blame, but on risk and prevention?
It really makes you think about the layers. Microbes, gut, brain, behavior, and then how society grapples with it.
It does. And given how complex these conditions are, IBS, potentially these brain disorders, it suggests, as the sources point out, that treatments need to become much more personalized, targeting this GBA system specifically.
So what are some of those potential treatments targeting the GBA? What did the sources highlight?
Well, a big focus is on modulating the microbiome itself. Probiotics come up a lot.
Live beneficial bacteria.
Exactly. Live microorganisms intended to provide a health benefit. The sources mention numerous studies showing they can help with some IBS symptoms, bloating, maybe bowel habit regularity.
Any specific types?
Effects seem very strain-specific, meaning one type might work differently from another, but lactobacillus and bifidobacterium strains often come up as showing promise in trials.
How might they work?
Potentially by improving that gut barrier function, maybe tweaking the immune response, influencing the HPA stress axis, maybe even having some direct effects on mood pathways.
Okay. And prebiotics.
Those are basically food for the good bugs, specific types of fiber or compounds that encourage the growth of beneficial microbes already living in your gut.
What about antibiotics? Seems like the opposite approach.
Usually in this context, antibiotics like rifaximin are used specifically to treat SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which can be a factor in some people's IBS. So it's about knocking back bacteria in the wrong place.
Right. And then the really cutting edge one, fecal microbiota transplantation, FMT.
Yeah, FMT, transferring a whole microbial community from a healthy donor. It's been remarkably successful for recurrent C. diff infections.
And for IBS or other GBA conditions.
The sources describe it as promising but still largely experimental for IBS, autism, depression, anxiety. Research is ongoing to figure out, who benefits most, what makes a good donor, how often it's needed, what the active components really are. Lots of unknowns still.
So that's tackling the microbes directly. What about targeting the communication lines themselves?
Yes, modulating the GBA pathways. This includes things we might think of as more traditional, like psychological therapy.
Like CBT or hypnotherapy.
Exactly. Cognitive behavioral therapy, gut-directed hypnotherapy, even simple relaxation techniques like deep breathing. These work top-down, calming the brain's stress response systems.
Which then calms the gut via the GBA.
Precisely. Reducing that stress-induced gut hypersensitivity and motility changes.
And diet comes back in here too.
Definitely. Beyond just avoiding triggers like FODMAPs, the sources mention broader dietary patterns, like the Mediterranean diet, which is linked to greater microbial diversity. So diet can potentially support GBA health more generally, not just manage symptoms.
Are there drugs targeting the chemical messengers?
Research is looking into that, targeting neurotransmitter systems like GABA, maybe using drugs that act on GABA receptors, potentially helpful for pain, especially since some gut bacteria even produce GABA.
And serotonin.
Serotonin's huge in the gut. Medications that modulate serotonin signaling, like certain antidepressants or specific 5-HT receptor drugs, are already used sometimes to manage IBS symptoms by affecting motility and sensation. Targeting bile acid pathways is another avenue being explored.
Any simpler things mentioned?
Peppermint ore capsules get a mention for helping with IBS pain and gas. and simethicone for gas, sometimes used alongside other treatments.
Okay, so pulling all this together, the nerves, the hormones, the immune cells, the trillions of microbes, the links to IBS, maybe anxiety, maybe even Alzheimer's. Why should someone listening care about all this complex gut-brain stuff?
Well, fundamentally, it helps make sense of your own body. It explains how things that might seem totally separate, like a nervous stomach and feeling anxious, are actually deeply connected.
It breaks down that old idea of the mind and body being separate.
Exactly, they're in constant conversation. Understanding this axis highlights how your physical health and your mental health are really two sides of the same coin.
And it also suggests areas where we have some agency, right? Lifestyle choices.
Absolutely. Things like diet, stress management, sleep choices we make every day likely have a real impact on this communication system and our overall health, both gut and brain.
The sources also hinted at some really cool future possibilities, too.
Yeah, some fascinating glimpses, things like potential brain self-checks using future tech. The idea from work on sensory substitution that the brain is incredibly adaptable, almost plug and play.
And how all this neuroscience, including the GBA research, might eventually influence other fields.
Right, like maybe transforming education by focusing more on how to foster critical thinking and adaptability, or informing that evolution of the legal system we touched on, moving towards a more brain-aware approach to behavior.
It really brings home that discovery process itself.
Yeah.
Like Dr. Eagleman's point about science and art both needing that imaginative leap.
Mm-hmm. Asking those what-if questions, exploring the unknown, whether it's outer space or, the universe inside our own gut.
So this deep dive into the gut-brain microbiome axis, it really reveals this incredible level of dialogue happening inside us, doesn't it? A complexity we're only just starting to map out.
It truly is. Trillions of microbes having these intricate conversations with our brain, influencing health in ways we never imagined, digestion, mood, maybe even cognition long term.
And while, yeah, there's clearly so much more to learn, the insights of these sources are already opening up really exciting possibilities for understanding ourselves and maybe finding new ways to treat challenging conditions.
Definitely. By looking at the body as this interconnected system rather than isolated parts.
So perhaps the question to leave you with is, how does learning about this hidden conversation change how you think about your own health and that intricate dance between your body and your mind?
Something to reflect on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive and exploring these fascinating sources with us.